It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I decided to take a walk through the old neighborhood, a choice driven by a sudden wave of nostalgia. The weather was perfect, with the sun hanging low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the familiar streets. I hadn't been back in years, not since I left for college, and I was curious to see how the place had changed. The streets were both familiar and foreign. New houses had sprung up where old ones had stood, their modern facades stark against the backdrop of ancient oak trees that had grown taller, their branches sprawling like the arms of giants. The once familiar corner store had been replaced by a sleek coffee shop, and the old diner where we used to grab milkshakes had become a boutique. Yet, amidst this evolving landscape, there was a strange sense of continuity, a feeling that time had moved on, but the essence of the neighborhood remained. As I wandered aimlessly, my footsteps guiding me almost unconsciously, I found myself drawn to the edge of the neighborhood where the small, forgotten playground lay. It had been my childhood haven, a place where laughter echoed and games were played under the watchful eye of the sun. I remembered the swings that creaked and the merry-go-round that spun with joyous abandon. But now, as I approached, I saw the playground in a state of neglect that was almost painful. The swing set was rusted, its once bright paint peeling and flaking like old scabs. The merry-go-round, now more a monument to rust than a source of fun, creaked mournfully with every gust of wind. The slide, once a beacon of childhood thrills, was now faded and slick, its plastic surface marred by the passage of time. The playground had a lonely, abandoned feel, as if it had been forgotten and left to the whims of the weather and the encroaching foliage. Still, a powerful sense of nostalgia drew me closer. I brushed off a pile of leaves that had gathered on one of the swings and sat down, the metal cold against my skin. As I began to rock back and forth, the familiar rhythm seemed to awaken long-buried memories. The days of playing tag with friends, the endless rounds of hide-and-seek, the laughter that seemed to come from some infinite well. These memories swirled around me like autumn leaves caught in a gust of wind. But one memory surfaced more vividly than the rest, a memory I had managed to bury deep over the years. It was the time I had met a peculiar child at this very playground. He was a little boy, no older than me at the time, who always wore a red cap. He had appeared out of nowhere one day, slipping into our games with an eerie silence. None of the other kids seemed to know him. He was always on the periphery, watching with an intensity that was unsettling, yet strangely fascinating. And then, as abruptly as he had appeared, he vanished, leaving no trace behind, but a lingering sense of unease. Lost in these thoughts, I was jolted by a faint, high-pitched giggle that seemed to drift on the breeze. I glanced around, expecting to see a stray child or perhaps a group of teens passing by, but the playground was empty. The laughter came again, more distinct this time, and I caught a fleeting glimpse of a small figure darting behind the merry-go-round. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the red cap peeking out from behind the rusty structure. It was him, the boy from all those years ago. But how was it possible? He hadn't aged a day. My legs felt like lead as I stood up, a shiver running down my spine. I took a hesitant step towards where I had seen him, but the boy giggled once more and dashed behind the slide. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I hurried after him, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. I reached the slide, my pulse pounding in my ears, only to find it empty. The boy was gone. I searched the entire playground frantically, calling out, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The leaves rustled in the breeze. The creaking of the merry-go-round was the only sound accompanying my growing sense of dread. As I finally left the playground, I was engulfed by a deep, unsettling silence. My mind raced with questions. Who was that boy? Why had he appeared so many years ago, and why did he reappear now? The memory of his eerie giggle and that red cap haunted me, a lingering enigma that seemed to defy explanation. I knew one thing for certain. I would not be returning to that playground. The mystery and the chilling encounter were enough to make me steer clear of this place forever. But as I walked away, something caught my eye. Something that hadn't been there before. Near the entrance of the playground, half buried in the dirt, was an old, worn-out doll. It was a rag doll with button eyes and frayed hair, its dress tattered and stained. A strange sense of recognition washed over me as I stared at it. This doll, I realized with a jolt, was identical to the one I had as a child. It had been my favorite toy, one I had carried with me everywhere until the day it went missing, vanishing without a trace, just like the boy with the red cap. I hesitated, then crouched down to pick up the doll. The moment my fingers touched its fabric, a sharp, cold wind whipped through the playground, chilling me to the bone. The temperature seemed to drop instantly, the warm autumn afternoon replaced by a sudden, unnatural cold. As I stood there, clutching the doll, I heard something else, a faint, whispering voice, barely audible over the howling wind. It was coming from the direction of the swings, the words unintelligible but filled with a sorrowful tone. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned towards the sound. The swings were moving now, swaying back and forth as if pushed by invisible hands. The whispering grew louder, and I could almost make out the words, though they were spoken in a language I didn't recognize. Fear gripped me, but curiosity compelled me to take a step closer, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The swings fell still, the wind died down, and the playground was silent once more. I looked down at the doll in my hand, a sense of dread growing in the pit of my stomach. Something was very wrong with this place, something that went far beyond the mysterious boy or the missing doll. I dropped the doll, turned, and walked away as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. The playground, once a place of joy, had become a place of darkness and unanswered questions. As I left the neighborhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that had been waiting there all these years. And though I never returned, the memories of that day, the boy, the doll, the whispers, continue to haunt me, a mystery I fear I will never fully understand. I had the night off from work and was relaxing in my apartment. My housemate, Sarah, had gone out of town for a few days to visit her sister, so I had the place to myself. I'm a bit of a night owl, so I was up late, enjoying the quiet. It was around midnight, and I was sipping a glass of wine while watching a movie when I heard a faint noise coming from upstairs. At first, it barely registered, almost like my mind brushed it off, but then it hit me. Sarah wasn't home, so it couldn't have been her. I paused the movie and glanced up at the ceiling, straining to hear the noise again. A few moments passed, and there was nothing. The sound was so faint that with the TV on earlier, I couldn't even tell where it had come from. Despite feeling a bit uneasy, I didn't want to get up and check it out. I convinced myself it was nothing and decided to grab another drink from the mini fridge by the couch. Just as I cracked open the bottle and was about to resume my movie, I heard that same soft thud from above. My eyes darted back to the ceiling, and this time I could hear what sounded like light footsteps, almost like someone tiptoeing in the room directly above me. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I stood up from the couch, moving towards the staircase. I stood at the bottom, listening intently. The noise was clearer now, a muffled thumping that echoed down the hallway. I called out Sarah's name, hoping against hope that somehow she had returned early. But deep down, I knew it wasn't her. After a few seconds of silence, I started climbing the stairs, my heart pounding with each step. I flicked on the hallway light, and the empty corridor greeted me. The door to Sarah's room at the far end was slightly ajar, even though I was certain I had closed it when she left. My pulse quickened as I approached the door. Inside, the room looked just as it had when she left, everything in its place and undisturbed. I checked every room upstairs, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The days that followed were suffused with an eerie tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows, seemed charged with a sinister energy, as if the apartment itself had become a living entity, watching and waiting. Sarah and I barely spoke about what had happened, but the unspoken dread hung heavy in the air, thickening with each passing night. I began to notice subtle changes around the apartment, lights flickering more frequently, shadows seeming to stretch and shift in ways that defied logic, and a persistent coldness that lingered in the corners of every room, no matter how high we turned up the heat. One evening, as we sat in the living room trying to distract ourselves with a TV show, the screen suddenly flickered and went black. The apartment was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls, growing louder until it was almost unbearable. And then, just as abruptly, it stopped, leaving behind a suffocating silence. We sat frozen in place, our breaths shallow and rapid, waiting for something to happen. The silence was shattered by the sound of footsteps, faint at first, then louder, coming from the hallway. The familiar creak of the floorboards under a weight that should not have been there. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin, as we both stared at the darkened hallway. The footsteps grew closer, a steady, rhythmic pace that sent icy tendrils of fear curling around my spine. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my body remained rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the overwhelming dread. And then, out of the darkness, a shape emerged, a shadowy figure, barely discernible in the faint light filtering through the window. It was small, childlike, and as it drew nearer, the air around us grew colder, biting at our skin. The figure stopped at the edge of the living room, its form wavering like a mirage. My heart hammered in my chest as I forced myself to look closer, squinting through the darkness. And then I saw it, those same bright, innocent eyes from Sarah's photograph, now hollowed by an unnatural emptiness, staring directly at us. The figure tilted its head, as if curious, before it slowly began to dissolve into the shadows, leaving behind a cold, oppressive silence that settled into the very marrow of my bones. We didn't sleep that night, and by morning, we both knew that something had to be done. But what? How do you rid yourself of a spirit that seems tied to your very home? As we debated our options, the apartment seemed to mock us, the walls creaking and groaning as if alive with malice. I felt as though we were intruders in our own home, unwelcome guests in the presence of something far older and more powerful than we could comprehend. And the worst part? The feeling that it wasn't over, that the shadowy figure was still lurking somewhere, waiting for the right moment to return. Days turned into a week, and the tension only grew worse. We began noticing strange symbols etched into the walls, faint at first, but growing more defined with each passing day. The symbols were unlike anything we had ever seen, intricate spirals and lines that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. They appeared overnight, in places we were certain had been untouched the day before. Each new discovery brought a fresh wave of dread, as if the apartment itself was trying to communicate something dark and ancient, something we were never meant to understand. Sarah's demeanor changed as well. She grew more withdrawn, her eyes hollow and dark-circled from lack of sleep. She started talking in her sleep, muttering in a language I couldn't recognize, her voice low and guttural. The words sent chills down my spine, and I could feel a malevolent presence in the room every time she spoke them. It was as if the entity was using her as a vessel, a means to communicate its intentions. I wanted to help her, to pull her out of whatever dark influence had taken hold, but every time I tried to wake her, she would lash out, her eyes unfocused and filled with a terrifying rage. The final straw came one night, when I woke to find Sarah standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes wide open but unseeing. She was holding a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light, and her lips were moving silently, forming words I couldn't hear. My heart nearly stopped as I slowly sat up, trying not to startle her. But before I could say anything, she turned and walked out of the room, the knife dragging along the floor behind her. I followed her at a distance, my fear mounting with each step, until she stopped in front of the hallway mirror. She stared at her reflection for what felt like an eternity, and then, in one swift motion, she brought the knife down, shattering the glass. The sound of breaking glass snapped her out of the trance, and she dropped the knife, her hands trembling. She looked at me, confusion and terror etched on her face, and we both knew that we couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. We packed our bags that night, leaving behind the shattered mirror, the strange symbols, and whatever malevolent force had taken hold of our home. As we drove away, I glanced back at the building one last time and saw a shadowy figure standing in the window, watching us leave. We never returned to that apartment, but the memory of those terrifying nights haunts us to this day. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll hear faint footsteps in my new home, or catch a glimpse of a shadow that shouldn't be there, and I'll wonder if we ever truly escaped, or if the unseen guest has followed us, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known once more. I was taking a short camping trip in Oregon, looking forward to a peaceful weekend getaway. The plan was simple: hike up to a secluded lake, set up camp, and spend the night under the stars. The drive up was uneventful, the winding roads flanked by dense forests that seemed to stretch on forever. By the time I reached the trailhead, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows through the trees, and the air was cool with the promise of evening. The hike to the lake was beautiful, the trail winding through ancient pines and past babbling brooks. As I climbed higher, I could feel the world falling away, the sounds of civilization replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. By the time I reached the lake, I was eager to set up camp and enjoy the solitude. But when I arrived, the lake wasn't as secluded as I had hoped. There were a couple of groups near the water, their laughter and chatter carrying across the still surface. It wasn't exactly the quiet escape I had envisioned, but I found a spot on the far side of the lake, away from the noise, and began setting up my tent. By around 5 p.m., both groups had started packing up, and within the hour, I was left alone with the entire lakeside to myself. With the sun beginning to set and the area now deserted, I quickly changed into my swim trunks and jumped into the lake. The water was cool and refreshing, and I swam out to the center, floating on my back as I watched the sky turn shades of orange and pink. As I glanced back at my campsite, everything seemed calm, but then I noticed someone standing at the edge of the forest, just past the beach. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but it was definitely a man, and he was definitely watching me. He stood perfectly still, his figure partially obscured by the trees. The moment our eyes met, he turned and disappeared into the woods. A wave of unease washed over me. Was it someone from one of the groups who had left earlier? Or maybe just a hiker who happened to glance in my direction at the wrong moment? The way he was just standing there, staring, gave me the creeps. I climbed out of the lake and headed back to my tent, all the while scanning the forest for any sign of the man. I dried off, cooked a small meal, and kept a wary eye on the tree line. An hour passed with no further sign of him, and I started to relax, thinking maybe I was overreacting. The sun had set by now, and the sky was filled with stars, their reflection dancing on the surface of the lake. I stayed up late, stargazing and enjoying the serenity of the wilderness. But as the night wore on, the sense of peace I had felt earlier began to erode, replaced by a growing sense of unease. It was nearly midnight when I finally settled into my tent, but sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig, seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. I told myself it was just the sounds of the forest, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. When I did finally drift off, my sleep was restless, filled with strange dreams that I couldn't quite remember upon waking. I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented and uneasy. The inside of my tent was pitch black, and the only sounds were the chirping of insects and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. I lay there, eyes wide open, trying to figure out what had woken me. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something strange. The zipper on my tent flap was partially open, and through the small gap, I saw a shape. My heart pounded as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, slowly, I realized it was a pair of eyes staring right back at me. Panic surged through me, and I instinctively grabbed the can of bear spray I kept nearby. I aimed it at the opening and unleashed a blast, hearing a man's yell as he stumbled away from the tent. My own coughing and tearing eyes made it hard to focus, but I managed to grab my pocket knife and scramble out of the tent, ready to defend myself. But when I looked around, the man was gone, vanished into the darkness. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The forest was eerily silent now, the usual nighttime sounds absent, as if the woods were holding their breath. I strained to hear any sign of movement, but there was nothing, only the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I wasted no time packing up my gear, using my GPS to navigate back to my car without retracing the trail. My eyes burned from the bear spray, and I could barely see, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I called the police, and they came to escort me home, but they found no trace of the man. I don't know what his intentions were, but the memory of those eyes peering into my tent still haunts me. I don't think I'll be camping alone again anytime soon. However, that wasn't the end of the strangeness. A few days after the incident, I received a call from the local ranger station. They had conducted a thorough search of the area where I had camped, hoping to find some clue about the man who had stalked me. But instead, they found something far more unsettling. Not far from where my tent had been, they discovered an old, dilapidated cabin hidden deep in the woods, one that wasn't marked on any map. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for decades, its roof partially caved in and the windows shattered. Inside, they found strange symbols carved into the walls, along with old, yellowed photographs of people who had gone missing in the area over the years. In the center of the cabin, there was a large, weathered table covered in more photographs, each one showing a person or group of people camping by the lake, some dating back nearly 50 years. And there, among the scattered photos, was one of me, taken just hours before I had left the campsite. It was the last photo on the table, the ink still fresh. The ranger who called me was clearly shaken, and he warned me to be careful, though he couldn't offer any explanation for what they had found. The authorities were looking into it, but the mystery of the cabin and its disturbing contents only deepened the fear that had taken root in me since that night. But even that wasn't the strangest part. About a week later, I began receiving postcards in the mail. Postcards from remote locations in Oregon that I had never visited. Each one had a short, cryptic message written in neat, old-fashioned handwriting. The first simply said, "We see you." The second read, "Come back soon." And the third, which arrived just days ago, had a photograph attached to it, an image of me taken from behind as I was packing up my gear by the lake. My heart raced as I stared at the photo, trying to make sense of it. How could someone have taken this without me noticing? And more importantly, why were they sending it to me now? I took the postcards to the police, but they offered little more than concerned looks and vague promises to investigate. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me, lurking just out of sight. Even in my own home, I started noticing odd things, my belongings slightly out of place, a window left open that I was sure I had closed. The sense of unease grew into a gnawing fear that something was closing in on me, something that had followed me back from those woods. And then, 2 nights ago, I woke to the sound of my front door creaking open. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the baseball bat I kept by my bed, moving as quietly as I could to investigate. As I crept through the darkened hallway, the silence was deafening, the air thick with tension. When I reached the living room, I froze. There, in the middle of the room, was the same bear spray canister I had used that night in the woods. It was placed carefully on the coffee table, standing upright, as if it were waiting for me. My blood ran cold. I hadn't brought the canister back with me. I had left it in the woods, discarded in my haste to leave. Someone had been in my house, someone who wanted me to know they could get to me anytime they wanted. I could barely breathe as I backed away, my mind racing with fear. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of anyone, just the bear spray canister, sitting there as if mocking my attempts to feel safe. Now, I sleep with the lights on, every creak and groan of the house sending a fresh wave of terror through me. I keep the doors and windows locked, but deep down, I know it's only a matter of time before they come back. Whoever, or whatever, is watching me, they haven't finished. And as the days drag on, I feel like I'm living on borrowed time, waiting for the moment when they decide to make their next move. The Watcher in the woods isn't just a memory, they're real, and they're coming for me.